Thank the whole panel for coming and testifying and giving us your insight and perspectives. You connect us to a noble and honorable moment in American history. And so we thank you for your hard work and the sacrifices that you've made. Ms. Johnson-Blanco, I want to start with you. Mr. Cooper invoked the strange absence of a universal affirmative constitutional right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. We, of course, have a sequence of ad hoc anti-discrimination amendments that were extracted through the blood, sweat, and tears of social movements. So the 15th Amendment said no race discrimination in voting. The 19th Amendment said no discrimination based on sex in voting. The 23rd Amendment gave people in D.C. the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment said no poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. But nowhere do we get what you find in most of the other constitutions in the world, which is a universal command of everybody having the right to vote and participate at every level of government. Like if you look at the new South Africa Constitution, that's why we're in the business of fighting to reconstruct a Voting Rights Act that was dismembered by a 5-justice conservative majority, treating the Congress of the United States like an administrative law tribunal, like some kind of administrative commission demanding to see what our evidence is for exercising our powers. But my question for you is a constitutional amendment for the right to vote on the agenda of the civil rights community today?
It is on the something that the civil rights community is looking at, because we're very concerned that a lot of the restrictions that are being imposed because there isn't an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. We do, however, acknowledge that recognize the right to vote through the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court in looking at the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. But there is
at least up until Shelby County versus Holder, where the Supreme Court, started to exercise strict scrutiny of congressional efforts to enforce the right to vote. But I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you. Let me, Mr. Jenkins and Ms. Nash, let me turn to you for a second. Both of you invoked your late colleagues and friends, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, others who lost their lives fighting against political white supremacy in the South. Viola Louisa, Medgar Evers, many others, people who were gunned down fighting for the right of people to vote. And I wonder, looking at the struggles today against the massive voter purges, which have included millions of people since 2016, looking at the efforts to vindicate the right to vote against this constant undertow of efforts to shut down polling places and make it more difficult to vote. What do you think about the sacrifice of the people that you worked with back in the civil rights movement? What do you say to their families today? Because I don't know how many people would actually give their lives in this cause. And what do you say to their family and friends, and what do we owe them? Ms. Nash.
I think that people today don't realize how patriotic Black people who fought for the right to vote were back in the early 60s. Just quickly, I'd like to mention that people who lived on plantations and had 15, 16 children would go down to the courthouse to try to register to vote, and someone at the courthouse would call back to the plantation and say, "Your Willie or your Mary is down here trying to vote." And by the time Mary or Willie got back to the plantation, they wouldn't have a job and they wouldn't have a place to stay with their huge family. And they kept doing that. And they knew that that was going to happen because it had happened so many times before, but they did it for the collective benefit. I would have trouble talking to their descendants today after those kind of sacrifices were made. I think present-day Americans owe them to reestablish the democratic right to vote. The right to vote is the basic unit of democracy. And one person, one vote, if we don't have that, I think we as a republic are in serious trouble.
Thank you. And Mr. Jenkins, do you have any reflections on that?
I think that the fundamental of the right to vote is the warp and woof of having a democracy. The reason this country claims to be a democracy is because it allows everybody to participate in the way in which the public policy of the country is being directed. And people need to understand that that right is inherent in them being a human being and being part of the politics and the body politic of the United States. And one of the things that worries me most is that some young people who are so discouraged by the way in which the suppression of the political participation has gone on, that they've given up and walked off. I think it's fundamental that we recognize not just the handful of names that we know, but many hundreds of names that we do not know. Remember that when they went to look for the bodies of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, they found hundreds and thousands of skeletons of unnamed people who had died. How many of them were victims of an undemocratic system? I think one of the things we have to remember is that fundamentally, we as a country have failed to live up to the ideals that we talk about when it comes to practice.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, is now recognized for his 5 minutes.